Somewhere outside Springfield, Ohio, in the early 1840s, there was a fork in the road with a sign on it. Families coming through with everything they owned roped down under a canvas would slow their teams, read it, and swing left, because the sign told them the left-hand branch was the national road. The sign was lying, and it was a good lie, because whoever built that road had thought it through. Every mile or so along it stood a cut stone marker with a number on it, counting the distance back to Cumberland, Maryland. One of those markers is still remembered in New Lebanon, Ohio, and the number on it was 337 miles, which is exactly what a real marker would have said, in the same style, measured from the same starting point, on the same kind of stone. It was a forgery, all of it. The National Road was the first highway the United States government ever built with its own money. Thomas Jefferson signed it into existence in 1806. It was supposed to climb out of Tidewater, Maryland, cross the Allegheny Mountains, and keep going until it hit the Mississippi River. And for about 30 years, it was the loudest 600 miles in America. Wagons hauling 3 tons of freight, stagecoach lines racing each other for the mail contract, taverns every single mile in the mountains, and a city called Dayton had been left off it. Dayton had lobbied Congress, Dayton had lobbied the state of Ohio, Dayton had lost. So Dayton's businessmen went out and built their own road, and then they dressed it up in the federal government's clothes, the sign at the fork, the counterfeit mile markers, all of it, and they went fishing for traffic that didn't belong to them. Here's the part that should stop you. It worked. For years, the majority of the traffic moving through that stretch of America's first federal highway was rolling along a road the federal government had nothing whatsoever to do with. And the reason it worked is not the reason you'd guess. I'll come back to it. But it leaves you with a question, and it's the question this whole story runs on. What exactly is a road worth that a city would counterfeit one? Because whatever the answer is, the United States government came to a different conclusion. It spent something like $6.8 million and 3 decades of political warfare building this thing, and then it stopped hundreds of miles short of the river it had promised to reach, handed the whole road over to the states one piece at a time, and walked away from the road business entirely for the better part of 80 years. This road died once to the railroad. It came back to life for the automobile, and then it died a second time, in the 1960s, to a machine that didn't even have to bother lying to it. There are stretches out there today where you can stand in one spot and see all 3 of them at once. Hand-broken stone under the grass, concrete beside it, and the interstate a couple hundred yards off, carrying everything, none of which starts with Jefferson. It starts with a dead general buried in the middle of a road, on purpose, so that wagon wheels would grind the grave flat. On July 13, 1755, a British Major General named Edward Braddock died of a chest wound in the Pennsylvania woods, 4 days after the worst military defeat the British had suffered in North America to that point. His column was in full retreat. French and Indian forces were somewhere behind them, and Braddock's body was a trophy waiting to be taken. So the 23-year-old Virginian, who'd been serving as his aide, made a decision. They dug the grave in the roadbed itself. Then the wagons and the men and the animals marched over it, again and again, until the ground looked like ground. The aide's name was George Washington. It worked for 49 years. Then, in 1804, a crew repairing that same stretch of road found bones. 2 years after that, Congress voted to build a national highway across those mountains, running right past the spot. I want you to hold on to that image, because this corridor has always been in the business of paving over whatever was there before. Nothing about the National Road was ever new ground. The line it followed had been a footpath long before any of these men used it, improved by a Delaware guide named Nema Collin, working with a frontier trader named Thomas Cressip, and Washington himself had traveled it in 1753 and again in 1754. Braddock's army widened it into a military road. The National Road would widen it again and give it a new name and a federal budget, the way American roads have always been built, by taking somebody else's road and calling it yours. Washington came back west in 1784, after the war, and this time he wasn't a soldier. He was a landowner with a nationalist nerves, and what he saw out there scared him. The revolution was won. The country was not finished. Between the Atlantic states and the settlements filling up along the Ohio River stood a wall of mountains, and on the far side of that wall were thousands of American farmers who had corn and whiskey and hogs to sell, and no practical way to get any of it to an American market. What they did have was a river. The Ohio ran into the Mississippi ran down to New Orleans, and New Orleans was Spanish. Washington's worry was not sentimental. He wrote that the Western settlers were standing on a pivot, that the touch of a feather would incline them one way or the other, and what he meant was that a man's loyalty tends to follow his money. Congress could put the West on a map in Philadelphia and lose it in practice, because a farmer in Kentucky doing all his business through a foreign port is not in any way that pays rent an American. Albert Gallatin, who shows up in a minute, later put the geography in a way that makes the whole problem obvious. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh are under 300 miles apart on land. Move a load of freight between them by the practical commercial route of the day, and you could be looking at something closer to 3,000 miles of travel, down the Ohio, down the Mississippi, out through the Gulf, around Florida, and back up the Atlantic coast. So the Alleghenies weren't a scenery problem, they were a loyalty problem, and the only tool anybody had for fixing it was a road. There's one more thing about that ground worth knowing. Washington eventually bought the tract at Great Meadows in southwestern Pennsylvania, the field where, as a 22-year-old, he had surrendered a fort to the French, the only time in his life he ever surrendered anything. He held that land until he died in 1799. The national road would run right past it, and in the 1830s, somebody put up a tavern on it to feed stagecoach passengers. Washington understood exactly what the country needed. What nobody could tell him was whether the government he'd just helped create was actually allowed to build it, or where the money would come from. The man who solved the money was a Swiss immigrant with an accent people made fun of for his entire career. Albert Gallatin was Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury, and he was a national planner in a country that had no national budget to plan with. Years later, going through his own papers, he found the letter where he'd first sketched the idea and wrote 4 words in the margin: origin of the national road. His mechanism was this. When Ohio came into the Union, a slice of the money the federal government made selling public land inside the state would be set aside for roads, 2% for a road leading to Ohio, 3% more for roads inside it. Gallatin had originally asked for 1/10 of all federal land revenue. He got 1/50, and he built a highway with it. And it was clever, because it fed itself. The government sells Western land. The sale pays for a road. The road makes the rest of the land reachable. The reachable land sells for more, which pays for more road, an engine running on its own exhaust. It also depended on a phrase, doing a lot of quiet work, public land. The whole scheme treats that ground as an asset the government already owns and can spend, which was true on paper and was not true anywhere else. The money that paved the first federal highway in the United States came out of land taken from people who were not consulted about the road or about anything else, and the reason it felt free to Congress is that somebody had already been made to pay for it. On March 29, 1806, Jefferson signed the act, $30,000 appropriated, 3 commissioners appointed to walk the ground and lay out the line. The law specified that the road be raised in the middle of the carriageway with stone, earth, gravel, and sand, with ditches cut on both sides. The section the federal government actually built first, from Cumberland out to the Ohio River, was called the Cumberland Road. As it pushed west, it picked up the names people still use, the National Road, the National Pike. It's all the same road. Cumberland got the eastern end because it sat at the practical head of navigation on the Potomac, and because roads from Baltimore already fed into it. The western end was aimed at the Ohio River, because that put you on water going where the settlers were, and the law left just enough wiggle room about where exactly to hit the river that a whole second war broke out over it. The commissioners were told to strike the Ohio somewhere between a point opposite the north edge of Steubenville and the mouth of Grave Creek, down near Wheeling. That's a stretch of riverbank about 30 miles long, and every town on it understood that the difference between being the terminus of the National Highway and being 12 miles from the terminus of the National Highway was the difference between a city and a wide spot. Wheeling won. Steubenville did not, and the fighting had started before a single stone was broken. Pennsylvania wanted the line angled so Philadelphia would benefit. Virginia wanted Richmond fed. There were committee reports and counter-proposals, and when the bill finally passed the House, it passed 66-50, with the Virginia delegation voting against it 16-2, and the Pennsylvania delegation voting against it 13-4. Read that again. The 2 states the road would physically cross were the 2 states most opposed to building it, not because they didn't want a road, because it wasn't crossing them in the right place. Gallatin himself pushed hard for the alignment through southwestern Pennsylvania, which happened to be his own political ground, and he made the argument to Jefferson in the frankest possible terms that those counties delivered the votes that kept Pennsylvania in the column, and that was worth considering when you drew the line. So before there was a road, there was already a lesson. And it's a lesson American politics has never once unlearned. The engineering question and the political question are the same question wearing different clothes. What Congress had not settled, what it would not settle for another 30 years, and what would eventually take the whole thing apart, was whether the United States was allowed to own the thing it was about to build. In May of 1811, the first construction contract went out, and men with picks and blasting powder and mules started up the narrows west of Cumberland. There was no federal road-building machine. There was no highway department, no engineering corps assigned to this, no stockpile of equipment. Congress let the work out in sections to private contractors, and the contractors hired whoever would swing a tool. The design was ambitious for the time. A right-of-way 66 feet wide, 4 rods, in the surveyor's language, cut clean through standing forest. Down the middle of it, a raised and cambered roadway built up in layers, the biggest stones at the bottom, then smaller, drainage ditches on both sides, masonry culverts, stone bridges, retaining walls where the mountain wanted to come down on it. And when I say stone, understand what that meant. Men sat beside piles of rock with hammers and broke it by hand until the pieces would pass through a ring, and then it was carted and spread and packed, also by hand, one wheelbarrow at a time, across the Allegheny Mountains. The mountain fought back the entire way. Grades came out steeper than the specification allowed, because there was no other way over. Rain moved the fill. Deep fills slid. Contractors ran out of money halfway through their sections and walked. And the ugliest part of it was that finished road started failing while unfinished road was still being cut, which meant the government was repairing one end of a project it hadn't finished building at the other. Inspectors found inferior mortar. They found stumps left in the roadbed and covered over. One Army officer's report on a stretch of it said flatly that the road was falling into disrepair faster than it could be built. A superintendent wrote that, in places, the surface was entirely destroyed or had sunk down beneath its own foundation. But then there's the Castleman River, near Grantsville, Maryland, where they had to get the road across a gorge. What went up there between 1813 and 1814 was a single stone arch with an 80-foot span, the longest of its kind in the country at that moment. The story that's come down with it is that people gathered to watch when they knocked out the wooden centering, because the local opinion was that the whole thing would come down in the water. It didn't. It's still standing. 2 centuries of freeze and thaw, and it has not moved. And that contrast runs through this entire story, so it's worth naming once. America could build permanent objects. America could not maintain a surface. The money went the way money goes. Out east in the mountains, the road cost something like $13,000 a mile. A private outfit like the Lancaster Turnpike, building in stone, had come in around $7,500. Some of the gap was terrain, and some of it was the contracting, and some of it was the small army of political appointees riding the payroll. A contemporary described them as being about as numerous as the locusts of Egypt. The man closest to the real problem was David Shriver Jr., the superintendent on the eastern end. Shriver spent years making an argument that every highway official in America has made since, and losing it. You cannot maintain a road, he said, by waiting for Congress to notice it's broken and pass an emergency appropriation. You need crews stationed permanently along the line, doing repairs continuously, forever. He didn't get them. Nobody got them. That request would still be sitting unanswered when the road's whole future came apart. On August 1, 1818, the National Road opened through to Wheeling, and the mail coaches started running, and every wheel that came onto it was quietly taking it apart. What happened next happened fast. The time and cost of moving freight between Baltimore and the Ohio River fell by roughly half, and 2 currents opened up on the same pavement, running in opposite directions. Eastbound, flour, bacon, tobacco, whiskey, cheese, and animals. Westbound, iron tools, cloth, china, glass, salt, sugar, coffee, and people. Between them, in both directions, the mail and the newspapers, and the politicians, and everyone selling anything. The machine that did the heavy work was the Conestoga wagon, and it deserves a minute. 17 to 19 feet of wagon bed, closer to 22, once you counted the canvas bonnet, standing about 11 feet tall, weighing 3,500 pounds empty. It hauled 6,000 pounds without complaint, and 10,000 if you pushed it. 6 horses pulled it. The body was painted blue, the running gear red, the canvas white, and there were bells. 3 to 5 of them arched over each horse's collar, which meant you heard a Conestoga a long time before you saw one. A whole team coming down a mountain grade sounded like a church having an argument with itself. There was no seat on a Conestoga. The driver walked beside it, or rode the lazy board, a plank that slid out of the wagon's left side, and that habit, riding on the left, walking on the left, so you could see the oncoming wheel, is one of the reasons Americans drive on the right side of the road today. Then there were the animals. Drovers pushed sheep and hogs and cattle and mules and even turkeys east toward the markets in Baltimore and Washington, and there were so many of them that they out-ate everything else on the road. A wagoner's worst day was a day behind a herd. Somewhere around 200,000 people a year were traveling this thing at its height. One man counted 133 six-horse wagons passing in a single day. Another counted 24 horse-drawn coaches lined up at one time. The best description of it came from a man named Thomas Jefferson, who grew up beside the road and wrote later that it looked more like the leading avenue of a great city than a road through rural districts, and the towns physically rearranged themselves around it. The road became Main Street. Buildings turned to face it. Blacksmith shops and wagon shops and stables and stores crowded the frontage until there was none left. New settlements grew out long and thin along the line instead of around a square, because the road was the square. Centerville, Indiana got so tight that property owners solved the problem by building brick archways over the passageways to the buildings behind, 5 of them, so they could take the frontage right out to the road and still get a wagon through. The arches are still there. The town throws a festival for them every August. And then there's Brownsville, Pennsylvania, which got rich in the strangest way of all. Brownsville sat on the Monongahela River, and what made Brownsville was that it was the place where you got off the national road. Freight came over the mountains by wagon, went down to the water, and continued by steamboat. So the town built steamboats. Between 1811 and 1888, something on the order of 3,000 of them were built in that area. Henry Shreve's enterprise left from there and became the first steamboat to run all the way down to New Orleans and back under its own power. The greatest boomtown on America's first federal highway was a place whose entire business model was helping you leave it. That's the thing about the road at its peak, and it's simple enough that everybody living on it understood it perfectly. The national road didn't have to make a town attractive. It made the town unavoidable. Nobody had to be talked into stopping. They were already standing at the door with money in their hand and horses that needed feeding. Which cuts exactly one way. If a line on a map can make a town unavoidable, then moving the line can make that same town invisible. And the people out there worked that out 130 years before anybody laid eyes on an interstate. Picture one ordinary day on it, somewhere in Pennsylvania in the 1830s. Before dawn, the stable hands are already out at the tavern, bringing up fresh teams. The stagecoach passengers eat fast, because the stage runs on a schedule and the schedule does not care about them. The wagoners take their time. They're checking harness, checking wheels, checking 6 animals they own outright and cannot replace if something goes wrong out there. Those two travel at completely different speeds. A loaded freight wagon makes about 15 miles in a day. A stagecoach runs 6 to 10 miles an hour, swapping horses every 12 to 15 miles, and can put 60 or 70 miles behind it before dark. The stages were businesses, and they behaved like it. They were painted and named and had murals on the doors, and they hated each other. The Good Intent Line, the Junebug Line, Stockton's National Road Stage Company, which people called the Old Line. They raced for passengers, and they raced harder for the mail contracts, and the drivers became famous in a way that's hard to explain now. Local men whose names people knew for 100 miles. A mail coach blew a horn coming into town so everything else would clear the road, and a mail coach paid no toll. And understand why the mail contract was worth fighting over, because this part gets lost. There was no telegraph yet. When something happened in Washington, a message to Congress, a treaty, a war, the way that news physically reached the Ohio Valley was a man on a box with 4 horses in front of him, running this road at night. The stage companies advertised their times the way airlines advertise them now. People came out of the taverns when they heard the horn, because whatever the driver threw down was the newest thing anyone in that county was going to know for a while. For about 30 years, the national road wasn't only how the country moved, it was how the country found out. The taverns are what the wagoners remembered. Seawright wrote that the road was renowned for the number and the excellence of its inns, and that up in the mountains, every mile had its tavern. But there were 2 different worlds inside that sentence. Stage houses, spaced roughly 12 miles apart, took the paying passengers. Wagon stands took the freight men. And Seawright gives you the class line in a single perfect detail. A drink of whiskey on the national road cost 3 cents. Except at the stage houses, where by reason of an assumption of aristocracy, it cost 5. For a wagoner, A night cost around $1.75 for a 6-horse team. That covered grain and hay for the horses, meals for the driver, and all the liquor he cared to put away. The tavern wasn't only a business either. Courts sat in them. Elections were held in them. There were dances, lodge meetings, traveling theater, preaching, and every piece of political organizing anybody did in that county. On this road, the law and the news and the whiskey all came through the same door. And then, somewhere along the day, you come to the gate, a toll house, 2 stories of brick, sometimes with an odd octagonal tower on the front so the keeper could watch both directions at once. A chain or a pole across the road, and a painted board with the rates on it, which is one of the most revealing documents in American history, and almost nobody has ever read it. 20 sheep through the gate cost 6 cents, 20 hogs, 6 cents, 20 cattle, 12, a man on a horse, 4 cents. A coach pulled by 2 horses, 12 cents, refused to pay, and the fine was $3, which in that economy was 2 nights and a lot of whiskey. But look at how they charged the wagons, because this is the detail I'd have you remember. The rate on a freight wagon depended on the width of its wheels. Narrow tires paid the most, and a wagon whose tires ran more than 8 inches wide went through the gate free. That's not a tax, that's an engineering instrument. Wide wheels rolled the surface flat and did the road a favor. Narrow wheels cut it into ruts, so the government built a pricing system that charged you precisely for the damage you did and paid you back for the good you did on a road in the 1830s, which is genuinely more sophisticated than most of what we do now. Hold that thought, because collecting that money turned out to be the one thing the United States government was not allowed to do. Everybody was out there. Andrew Jackson rode this road, so did Monroe, and Lafayette on his farewell tour, and a young Abraham Lincoln, and later on P.T. Barnum and the singer Jenny Lind. And so did tens of thousands of people whose names nobody bothered with. Drovers sleeping outdoors with their animals, teamsters, kids walking beside wagons. It's also worth being straight about what this road actually was. It ran out of Maryland and Virginia, where slavery was legal, into Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, where it wasn't. Everything moved on it. Freight moved on it, and people who were being sold moved on it, and people running north moved on it too, and the stone didn't distinguish. The National Road opened up movement for an enormous number of Americans, and the freedom it handed out was not distributed evenly among the people doing the moving. At night, the stage changes horses and keeps going, because the mail doesn't sleep. The wagoner beds down by a fire in the wagon yard. The road never really goes quiet, and underneath all of it, iron tires are grinding stone, and rain is filling the ruts, and there is a bill coming that nobody in Washington has agreed to pay. Meanwhile, the towns had figured out the arithmetic. A town on the route got customers it never had to earn. A town 10 miles off the route had to talk people into leaving the main road, which almost nobody does when they're tired and behind schedule. That gap was the difference between becoming a county seat and staying a crossroads with a church. So when Congress extended the road west, the fight got vicious, and the rule Congress had set made it worse. The western extension was supposed to run essentially between the state capitals, Columbus, then Indianapolis, then Vandalia, Illinois, in as straight a line as the ground allowed. Dayton, Ohio was not on that line. Neither was Eaton. They lobbied Congress. They lobbied the state. And President Andrew Jackson, who had opinions about federal money and roads that we'll get to shortly, enforced the straight alignment and sent the surveyors off toward Richmond, Indiana instead. The detour Dayton wanted would have added about 4 miles. They lost anyway, and they refused to accept it. 2 private turnpike companies formed, the Dayton and Springfield and the Dayton and Western, and they built the alternative themselves. Then they did the thing that makes this a story instead of a business decision. They put up the sign at the Springfield Fork. They lined their road with copies of the federal mile markers, cut in the same style, counting the same miles back to Cumberland. The Dayton Western Turnpike opened for toll in August of 1841, wearing a costume. And now here's what I held back at the beginning. The costume is not why it won. It won because it was a better road, better surface, bigger towns, more places to buy a meal and shoe a horse and sell what you were carrying. The forgery got people onto it the first time. What kept them coming was that the counterfeit was genuinely the superior route, and word travels fast among men who drive for a living. Between Springfield and Richmond, the fake National Road carried most of the traffic on the real one, which tells you something the United States government was about to learn the hard way, at enormous expense. Congress could designate a road. Congress could not make anybody drive on it. The traffic was never loyal to the flag or the appropriation or the surveyor's line. It was loyal to whatever was faster and easier, and it always has been. And the counterfeit outlived the argument, by the way. In the 20th century, when the automobile people started stitching a coast-to-coast route together, they folded Dayton's fake road right into it, and eventually it got a federal shield of its own. The forgery became official. That was one fight between two Ohio towns over a few miles of dirt. The next one was at the Mississippi River, and it helped kill the entire project. But by the time that fight happened, Washington had already lost its nerve over a question nobody had thought to ask in 1806. Who exactly is allowed to stand in a road and take your money? The practical problem came first, and it was undeniable by the 1820s. Federal money had built the road, free access had filled it, and the traffic that made it valuable was chewing it back down into gravel, faster every year, with no revenue attached to any of it. Shriver had been saying it since before the road reached Wheeling, and nothing had changed. So Congress reached the obvious solution: put up federal toll gates, let the people wearing the road out pay to keep it whole. The bill passed. In 1822, President James Monroe vetoed it, and Monroe was not against roads. That's what makes this worth understanding. His objection was about what a gate actually requires you to do. To collect a toll, you need jurisdiction, the power to stop a citizen inside a sovereign state, to demand money from him, to fine him if he refuses, to seize land for a right-of-way, to police the ground. Monroe went through every clause anybody had ever cited as the authority for that. The post-roads clause, the war power, commerce, the general welfare, necessary and proper, and he concluded one after another that the power was not there, which left the country in an absurd position. Congress could pay for a road, Congress could not run one. Monroe wasn't inventing this out of nothing, either. Madison had vetoed a road and canal funding bill in 1817 on similar grounds, and in 1830 Andrew Jackson would veto the Maysville Road, a turnpike sitting entirely inside Kentucky, and say plainly that if Americans wanted the federal government building their roads, they were going to have to amend the Constitution first. The argument was hardening, and the national road was standing in the middle of it, getting worse every winter. Henry Clay fought for the other side his whole career. Roads, canals, tariffs, national development, all of it one connected system he called the American system, and the national road was his physical proof that it worked. He was right about the road, he lost anyway. So Congress found a compromise, and the compromise is the single most revealing thing in this entire story. The federal government would repair the road one last time, bring it up to standard, and then hand it over to the states it ran through. And the states, being states, immediately turned around and did the exact thing the federal government had just been told it had no right to do. They put up gates. Maryland took its section in 1833, Pennsylvania in 1836, Virginia in 1838, Ohio and Indiana at the end of the 1840s, Illinois last in 1856. Seawright's toll house went up on the Pennsylvania stretch in 1835. Brick, 2 stories, that octagonal tower, one of 6 gates on that state's portion alone. It's still standing today, and that rate board with the 8-inch wheels on it is a state document, not a federal one. Same gate, same road, same chain, same money, same traveler paying it. Perfectly legal because somebody else was holding the chain. America never decided that roads shouldn't be paid for. America decided who was allowed to collect, and the consequence of that decision is enormous, so let it sit for a second. After the national road, the federal government of the United States would not fund an ordinary public road again for the better part of 80 years. Out west, though, the surveyors were still moving, because the road wasn't finished. It had a promise attached to it, and the promise was about to break in the most quietly devastating way possible. The promise had gotten bigger over the years, past Wheeling, across Ohio, across Indiana, across Illinois, over the Mississippi, and on to Jefferson City, Missouri. That was the target Congress had settled on by 1825. And it did move. Zanesville, Columbus, Springfield, into Indiana, reaching the eastern edge of Indianapolis by 1836 and Terre Haute by 1838. But it got thinner as it went, and this is the part that almost every version of this story leaves out. The careful engineered stone road of the eastern mountains was never reproduced out west. In Ohio, the road averaged something like $3,400 a mile against $13,000 back east. In Indiana, a great deal of what the federal government paid for was clearing timber, grubbing stumps, grading and ditching, which is a road-shaped corridor, not a road. And in Illinois, where there wasn't decent stone to break, they worked with clay. Out of the whole Illinois section, about 31 miles ever got a finished surface. Parts of it ran into swamp, parts of it still had stumps in them. so understand what the map was actually showing. The National Road existed as a federal route years before it existed as a road. Then it hit the Mississippi question and stopped dead. The crossing was supposed to happen somewhere between the Illinois River and St. Louis, and there were two candidates: Alton North in Madison County, or the southern line towards St. Louis. Alton argued its route was cheaper. St. Louis argued it was already the commercial capital of the West and the road should go where the business was. And Illinois had a veto, because the original law required the consent of the states the road passed through. Illinois would consent to Alton and to nothing else. Missouri wanted St. Louis. Congress never broke the tie. Alton, for its part, played every card it had. It went so far as to campaign to become the capital of Illinois on the theory that whoever held the state house would hold the road. It lost that fight too, to Springfield, which won because a block of legislators known as the Long Nine worked the votes to move the capital there. One of the Long Nine was a young representative from Sangamon County named Abraham Lincoln, which sets up the saddest thing in this entire story, and it's small, and it's perfect. The National Road finally reached Vandalia, Illinois at the end of the 1830s, 591 miles from Cumberland. 30-odd years of appropriations and vetoes and broken stone and men dying on mountainsides. It arrived at the state capital of Illinois in the same window that Illinois stopped having its capital there. The government packed up for Springfield. Vandalia's population fell, and America's first federal highway came to its final stop in front of a state house that was in the process of becoming an empty building. The last major appropriation was signed in 1838. In 1840, Congress voted against completing the project at all. Add up everything the federal government ever spent on the road across the whole period, and you get somewhere around $6.8 million for a highway that never touched the river it was built to reach. And then, in 1839, with Washington already walking away, federal money finished one last thing. At Brownsville, Pennsylvania, over Dunlap's Creek, they completed a cast-iron arch bridge, the first one in the United States. It is still carrying traffic. The single most advanced object the National Road ever produced was finished right as its builder quit. Nobody killed this road. That's what's hard about it. No president, no panic, no city. It was constitutional doubt and sectional horse trading and the crash of 1837 and the endless unpaid bill for maintaining what already existed, all pulling in the same direction at once. And underneath all of that, there was a growing suspicion in Washington that the future was going to run on rails. Which brings up something almost nobody knows. Congress was offered the chance to turn the National Road into a railroad and said no. In 1836, a proposal came before the House to replace the turnpike west of Columbus with a railway. The committee actually ran the numbers on a 334-mile stretch, and they came back with annual maintenance of roughly $393,000 a year as a road, against about $174,000 as a railway, less than half. They added a military argument on top, that in a war a few days or even a few hours can decide a campaign, and rails move troops in hours. Congress rejected the amendment and kept funding the stone. Sit with that one for a second. The government was handed the machine that was going to destroy this road, with the math already done, and it voted to keep the wagons. The canals took the heavy freight first, then the railroads came and took everything else. On January 1, 1853, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad reached Wheeling. Pennsylvania's rail system tied the eastern cities to Pittsburgh and the country beyond it. And Seawright, who lived through it, drew the line in one sentence. From the day it opened in 1818 until the railroads came west of the Allegheny Mountains, the National Road was the one great highway over which the bulk of the trade and travel of the country passed. After that, it wasn't. And right at that hinge, the two dying worlds turned on each other in the strangest court case of the era. In 1849, a bridge opened at Wheeling to carry the National Road across the Ohio River. Charles Ellet designed it, a suspension span of 1,010 feet between the towers, and when it opened, it was the longest bridge span on Earth. Pittsburgh sued to have it destroyed. The argument was that the bridge sat too low and blocked the tall smokestacks of the steamboats going upriver, which was a genuine commercial injury and also an excellent excuse to hurt a rival. Pennsylvania's industrial interests hired a lawyer named Edwin Stanton, the same Edwin Stanton who would later run the War Department for Lincoln, and in May of 1852, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled for Pittsburgh. The bridge could stay only if it were raised 111 feet above low water, which was impossible. It was a demolition order with better manners. Congress responded 3 months later by simply declaring the bridge a post road, entitled to federal protection because it carried the mail. If the steamboats had a problem, the steamboats could hinge their smokestacks. Then in 1854, a windstorm came down the valley and tore the bridge apart anyway. Pennsylvania went back to court to block the rebuilding, and lost, and the bridge went back up, and it is still there. A river town and a mountain road, fighting each other all the way to the Supreme Court over who got to own the traffic, while the thing that was going to take the traffic from both of them was already laying track through the hills behind them. The collapse on the road itself came in a chain, and every link of it was somebody's living. The stage lines cut runs, then cut routes, then folded. The wagoners lost the long hauls first, and then most of the short ones. The blacksmith, who had made his money reshoeing 6-horse teams, found there were no 6-horse teams. The farmer who sold hay and eggs and oats to the tavern found the tavern wasn't buying because the tavern had no guests, because the guests were on a train. Then the cooks and the hustlers and the stable hands and the girls who changed the beds were all out of work in a village with nothing else in it. The traffic did not stop existing, it just stopped coming through there. And it wasn't uniform, because it never is. Towns with coal underneath them, or an ironworks, or a rail connection of their own, came through it fine. Brownsville is the honest example. Its road era ended, and it went right on for another century on steamboats and coal and steel, and got bigger than it had ever been. 8,000 people by 1940. That town's ruin, when it finally came from the mills closing, not from the wagons leaving, but the places whose entire economy was the fact that strangers had to pass through them, had nothing to fall back on, because being unavoidable was never a business, it was a location. The states started handing sections down to the counties. Maintenance more or less stopped. Gates came down. Taverns turned back into farmhouses, and then into nothing. And then in 1894, an old man in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, sat down to write it all out before the last people who remembered it were dead. Thomas Seawright was the son of William Seawright, the commissioner Pennsylvania named that toll house after. He had grown up on the Pike when it was still the Pike. And the book he produced, he called it The Old Pike, is one of the strangest documents in American history, because it is a man attempting to convince his own countrymen that the weedy lane running past their farms used to be the busiest place in the United States, and that he had personally watched it happen, and that nobody was going to believe him much longer. He was writing an obituary. He was about 20 years early, because the machine that brought the road back to life hadn't been invented yet when Seawright started writing, and the people who started the campaign for better American roads weren't drivers at all. They were bicyclists, city men riding out into the countryside in the 1880s and 90s and discovering that outside the city limits, the United States basically had no roads. They organized, they lobbied, they got laughed at. Then the automobile arrived and turned their hobby complaint into a national emergency. And the old national road had two things almost nothing else in America had. It had an intact east-west corridor that already went somewhere, and it had a name people still recognized, which mattered enormously, because in that era, roads were sold to the public like brands. In 1912, it became the eastern spine of the National Old Trails Road, a marked route running all the way from the Atlantic to Los Angeles. And Dayton's counterfeit went in with it. 80 years after the forgery, the fake National Road was welded permanently into the real one. Then in 1916, something happened that most people have never connected to any of this. Congress passed the Federal Aid Road Act, and the federal government started paying for roads again, 78 years after the last national road appropriation. But look at how they did it. The states would build the roads, the states would own the roads. The states would maintain and police the roads, Washington would put up part of the money and set the standards. Monroe's veto had become the permanent architecture of American highways, and nobody even had to argue about it anymore. That was just how roads worked now. On November 11, 1926, the numbered highway system was adopted, and the national road became the eastern half of United States Route 40. Same day, a road out in the southwest got the number 66, incidentally. The oldest highway in the country, and the most famous one, got their numbers on the same afternoon. And the roadside economy rebuilt itself, the same organism around a different animal. Filling stations where the livery stables had been, garages instead of wagon shops, diners and truck stops where the wagon stands stood, motor courts and motels where the stage taverns had been, and in a few cases inside the actual stage taverns. Trucks became the new Conestogas, hauling freight over the same grades, and the road ran 24 hours a day. The Red Brick Tavern at Lafayette, Ohio, which had been feeding stagecoach passengers since the 1830s, was feeding motorists. At Blaine, Ohio, they built a concrete viaduct in the 1930s for United States 40 right beside an 1828 stone S-bridge that had carried the national road. And if you want to know why those old Ohio bridges are S-shaped, it's because a stone arch is cheapest and strongest when it crosses the water square, so the road curved to meet the creek at a right angle and curved back. The road bent so the bridge wouldn't have to. Meanwhile, the country had already started treating the road as history while it was still the main way west. Starting in 1928, the Daughters of the American Revolution planted 12 identical monuments along the National Old Trails Road, a pioneer woman in stone, one per state, 5 of them standing on the National Road itself. Around 5,000 people turned out at Wheeling Park on July 7, 1928 for one of them. The president of the National Road Association was supposed to speak and got called back to Missouri for court duty. He was a county judge at the time. His name was Harry Truman. By the 1950s, this corridor was carrying more than it ever had in the wagon days, and the towns strung along it were doing fine. And somebody wrote it down, which turns out to matter enormously. In 1953, a Berkeley professor named George Stewart published a book called United States 40. It's an odd thing, he drove the whole road and photographed it in sections, mile by mile, town by town, and wrote about what he saw at each stop. Not a travel guide. More like a core sample of the country, taken at the exact moment the automobile road was at its height. 30 years later, 2 geographers named Thomas and Geraldine Vail went out and found the precise spots where Stewart had stood, and photographed them again, and published the pairs side by side. Which means that for this one corridor, we have something almost nobody else has. A before and an after, from the same tripod, of what happened to a road when the traffic left. And what happened in between is the thing that was already being drawn up in Washington while Stewart was out there taking his pictures, by the same government that had once decided it had no business owning a highway, and was now planning the largest construction project in the history of the world. On June 29, 1956, Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, and the interstates began. I want to be fair about what came next, because the tragedy doesn't work if you pretend the new road was a mistake. It wasn't. By the 50s, United States 40 was pushing loaded semi-trucks and vacation traffic and school buses and farm equipment through brick main streets that had been laid out for 6-horse wagons in 1830. There were traffic lights every few blocks. There were kids crossing. People were dying at those intersections, in numbers, every year. Interstate 70 was divided, controlled access, gently graded, and it did not run through anybody's downtown. It was a better road. That's the whole problem. Because here's the difference between the two, stated as plainly as I can. On United States 40, the highway and the town's main street were frequently the same pavement. On Interstate 70, the town is a word on a green sign, and there's an exit number under it. The old road delivered every single traveler to your door. The new road asks your door to go out and compete for him. Indiana got its first piece on September 17, 1961, opening around Richmond, right past Centerville and its 5 brick arches. Then section after section through the 60s, and the middle of Indianapolis wasn't finished until 1976. In eastern Ohio, they built the interstate alongside the old road, and in stretches, they built it directly on top of it, which is about as literal as this story ever gets. And out west of Morristown, Ohio, there's a thing you can go look at that says everything. The 4-lane United States 40 that used to carry this corridor is still out there. It runs a short distance west and then simply stops, cut off by a hillside and a pond. Abandoned westbound lanes sitting beside the interstate, overgrown in places, used for parking in others. That's not a wagon age ruin. That's a dead superhighway from the automobile age, lying about 40 feet from the live one, with weeds coming up through it. What went with it wasn't dramatic. That's why it's hard to film and easy to ignore. A tank of gas, a meal, a transmission repair, one night in a motel, something a kid talked his parents into buying at a counter, and the thing you can never get back, which is the chance that a stranger notices a town he wasn't looking for and comes back next year on purpose. Ohio's own highway documents record it in flat administrative language. Pike towns that were bypassed declined, as the businesses serving travelers moved to the interstates. The village pub at Jacksontown closed and the building came down. The drive-in went. The motels went. And now go back to Dayton for a second, Because the road told us all of this the first time, and nobody was listening. In 1841, Dayton took the traffic off America's first federal highway by offering a better route, and it needed a fake sign and counterfeit mile markers to get the first wave of drivers to try it. 120 years later, the Interstate did the same thing on a national scale and needed no forgery at all. A blue shield, an on-ramp, and the promise that you would not have to stop was enough. Nobody was tricked. Everyone chose it, one driver at a time, each of them making a decision that was completely reasonable, and the sum of all those reasonable little decisions emptied 400 main streets between Baltimore and the Mississippi.
Hello, it's Dale here. You're not done yet, but let me interrupt for just a few seconds. If you enjoy Backroads and want to help us keep making these videos, please consider supporting the channel by scanning the QR code on your screen or using the link below. Even $5 or $10 really helps us keep finding these places, researching their stories, and bringing them to you. If you can help, we truly appreciate it. Backroads only keeps going because of viewers like you. Thank you. God bless you. And now, back to the video.
And there's one more thing about Interstate 70 that closes this whole story, and almost nobody knows it. The federal government paid 90% of the cost of the interstate system. It set every design standard, assigned every number, approved every mile of alignment, and it does not own an inch of it, not one. The Federal Highway Administration will tell you so in exactly those words on its own website. The states own and operate the interstate highways. The road that goes past those dead lanes at Morristown, carrying everything that used to stop there, belongs to Ohio. So here's where 200 years of this lands. The United States of America has built one road that it actually owned. One. It broke that road out of a mountain by hand, it ran the road, it repaired the road, and then it decided that standing in that road and taking a nickel from a farmer was a power it had never been given, and it gave the road away in pieces, one state at a time, starting in 1833. Every highway you have ever driven on in this country belongs to somebody else. That's not an accident of administration. That's the scar tissue from an argument about the national road that ended before the Civil War. The road is still out there. It's just hard to see as one thing anymore. Some of it is still United States 40, with a stripe down the middle and a speed limit. Some of it became a state highway, then a county road, then a township road, with grass growing up the center hump. Some of it got widened and straightened and buried under the interstate, and some of it was just left alone where it was, which is the only reason any of it survived at all. There's a stone arch out there carrying a road nobody photographs. There's an S-bridge stranded in a field with the creek moved out from under it, arching over dry grass, going nowhere on either end. A toll house with an octagonal tower standing beside a road that hasn't charged anybody a nickel since the horses left. A stage tavern with a bed and breakfast sign in the yard. A motel sign from 1958 with no bulbs in it. And there's one stretch you can't visit at all because it's underwater. The National Road crossed the Youghiogheny River in 1818 on a stone bridge at a place called the Great Crossings, and a village named Summerfield grew up around it. Houses, a hotel, the usual pike town. In the 1940s, the Army Corps of Engineers dammed the river, and the bridge and the town went under the reservoir together. Most years you'd never know. But in a hard drought, when the lake drops far enough, the water pulls back off the top of a stone arch the National Road used to run across, and people drive out there and stand on it. That's the National Road at this point. Occasionally the country recedes enough that you can see it. Ohio set 226-mile markers along its section of the National Road. 83 of them are still standing, cut stone at the edge of the pavement, counting off the distance to Cumberland, Maryland, for drivers who are not measuring anything from Cumberland, Maryland, and mostly could not tell you where it is. And out at New Lebanon, Ohio, there's a historical marker where one of the fakes used to stand. 337 miles to Cumberland, it said, because that number was the whole point of the lie. The counterfeit is the thing being commemorated now. The road it was imitating is mostly under something else. They did what they could with the rest. 824 miles across 6 states, designated an All-American road in 2002. Toll houses restored, taverns saved, brown signs at the county lines. But you can restore a building, and you cannot restore the reason anybody had to walk into it. The people who come out here now come deliberately, which is lovely, and which is the exact opposite of how this road ever worked. Its entire economy was built on travelers who had no other option. There are places along that corridor where you can stand and see the whole 200 years in a single glance. Broken stone under the grass, right at your feet, laid by men with hammers who were paid by the day. The concrete beside it, poured for the automobile, cracked and patched and still holding. And out past the fence line, the interstate, running east and west with the whole country on it, at 70 miles an hour, all day and all night, and not one truck on it is going to stop here. That traffic is still headed west. It's moving faster tonight than Washington could have imagined when he sat on a horse in 1784 and worried about losing the country. The connection he wanted got built. It got rebuilt twice more after that, better each time. It's just that every time America found a faster way through, it found out it didn't need the places it had been going through. If this is the kind of thing you like, tell me in the comments about a road near you that used to be the main road, the one your town was built along before something faster came through. I read them. A like helps this find other people, and if you're new here, subscribe, because there's a lot more of this coming. And there's another one on your screen right now that I think you're going to want. The national road never actually disappeared. America just kept paving over it.